Okay, now the opposite is also true. So when the temperature is below normal, again, that is a stimulus, that is a change that will get picked up by the receptors, thermoreceptors. The thermoreceptors will talk to the brain, and in this case, we have two options. In our first option, the effectors will tell the blood vessels to constrict, to become smaller. There would be a decrease in blood flow because when blood is flowing, heat would escape that way. And this causes a response, and this response will continue to happen until temperature is back to normal. Another avenue would be the effectors will tell the muscles to start shivering. Okay, that movement will cause heat production, and this response will continue to happen until temperature is back to normal. All right, big section would be the organization of the human body. So in order for scientists or medical personnel to talk about the body in a very organized manner, the body is basically cut up into sections. And we have a lot of objectives for this section, but we are going to cross out a few of them. Let's see. We don't need to list organs. Okay, so we don't have to worry about organs at this point that are found in each in the major systems. And then we're not going to have to worry about the functions of each organ system at this point. In terms of organization, and when we're thinking about the entire body, we can cut it up into two broad categories. Again, these are broad categories. And that would be the axial portion of the body. And then we have the appendicular portion of the body. In terms of the axial portion of the body, we're talking about the head, the neck, the vertebral canal, where you find your spinal column, the trunk, and then everything else will be the appendicular section. So again, when we're thinking about the body, we can cut it up into two broad categories. We have the axial and then we have the appendicular. The axial will include the head, the neck, vertebral canal, and the trunk. And then everything else, which we also refer to as appendages, so your hands and your legs, would be under the appendicular section or category of the body. Okay, we're going to cut these up further. So again, those are broad categories. We can go back or we can go into each section and cut it up even further. So the axial cavity, and when we're thinking about cavity, we're thinking about an opening or an enclosure. Okay, so again, when we're thinking about cavity, we're thinking about an enclosure. And this enclosure is able to contain other parts or other things, or even other cavities. So for the head, we can cut it up into the cranial cavity and then the smaller cavities. For the neck, it's just the neck. For the vertebral canal, it contains the spinal cord. And then for the trunk, we can cut it up into the thoracic cavity and then the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, again, in the trunk area, we can cut it up into thoracic cavity and then the abdominopelvic cavity. And both of them, both the thoracic and abdominopelvic, they contain the viscera, or also known as the organs. Okay, so if you need to pause at this point to kind of organize the information that we just looked at, go ahead and do that. But here's an image in your textbook that shows those different sections of the body or different cavities. So for the head, we have the cranial cavity, which encloses the brain. Then we have the vertebral canal, which houses the spinal cord, right here. We have the thoracic cavity, so the chest area. We have the abdominopelvic cavity, which would be all the areas below that. And then in the middle, we have, separating the two cavities, we have the diaphragm. And then for the abdominopelvic cavity, we can further divide it into the abdominal cavity. Okay, so we have the abdominal area right here. And then the lower part would be the pelvic cavity. Okay, so again, for anatomy and physiology, there are a lot of terms that needs to get organized in your brain. And so if you have to keep going back to this video, or if you have to take a minute and look at the diagram, go ahead and do so. All right, so let's do that again. So we have the cranial cavity. Actually, let me backtrack. All right, so we have two broad categories. We have the axial and we have the appendicular. In the axial cavity, or the axial category, we have the head, the neck, the vertebral canal, and then the trunk. Okay, so that's all that are contained in the axial portion of the body. Everything else is found in the appendicular portion, which would be the appendages, your hands, and your legs. In the axial cavity, again, cavity is an enclosure that can contain other parts or other cavities. We have the head, which contains the cranial cavity and then smaller cavities. The neck, and then the vertebral canal, which contains the spinal cord, and then the trunk, which can be divided into the thoracic cavity and then the abdominopelvic cavity. Both of these will house the organs or the viscera. So anytime you hear me say viscera, I am referring to the organs. So that would be the intestine, the large intestine, the spleen, the liver, and so on. Okay, cranial cavity is found in this portion which contains your brain. We have the vertebral canal, which contains the spinal cord. The thoracic cavity, which would be in the chest area, which contains the heart and the lungs. We have the abdominopelvic cavity, and in between those, in between the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities would be the diaphragm. And then again, abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into the thoracic abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. All right, so now we can go further and talk about what's contained inside those cavities. So for the cranial cavity, it houses the brain. The smaller cavities would be divided into oral cavity, so this would be the mouth, nasal cavity, which would be the cavities in the nose area, orbital cavity, that would be the eyeball socket, and then we have the middle ear cavity, which would contain the parts of your ear, the ones that you do not see. And then we have the neck, which we won't be able to divide into smaller things. Vertebral canal contains, again, the spinal cord, and then we have the trunk. Okay, so this is an image in your textbook, and yes, you need to be able to label these in a quiz or exam. So we have the cranial cavity, followed by the orbital cavities, which would contain your eyeballs, the nasal cavity, which extends down into the throat. We have the middle ear, so this would be the part that cannot be seen. So this is your outer ear. And then the middle ear would be the ones that you do not see. And an oral cavity, that would be the mouth area. In terms of the nasal cavity, it is composed of the frontal sinus. Okay, so the sinus above your eyes, and then the sphenoidal sinus, which would be behind the nose and then behind the eyeball area. Okay, so again, make sure to note of these. So when we're thinking about the nasal cavity, we have two sinuses present. We have the frontal and then the sphenoidal sinus.